Welcome to the At Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. When I first read Kevin Sweeney's initial book, The Making of a Mystic, I found a bit of a kindred spirit, a somewhat unlikely person in the pastorate, as well as a relatively unlikely person when one thinks of terms like mystical or contemplative. You might remember that conversation on this very podcast about that initial book from last season. His most recent book is called The Joy of Letting Go, and it actually met me exactly where I needed to be met when I picked it up as well. His language is a wonderful bridge between the everyday experience of life and the desired sacred posture with which I want to live in that everyday life. I enjoyed this conversation. I think you will as well. Check it out.
I don't know if it was intentional. I don't remember the origins, how it just happened. But when I wrote my first book, I sat like right now how I'm facing. And when I wrote the second one, I turned and looked out. I don't know why that was.
That's actually a little bit interesting. We can make all kinds of crap up about that. And some of it would be right.
Yeah, it'd definitely be close, I'm sure.
How are you in general? Quick check-in, personal. How you doing? Well? How are things overall?
Yeah, I don't know if you know that, but like we shut down our church at the end of May.
I remember that.
Okay, yeah. So
that's part of why I'm asking, because it was kind of a big deal. One of the bits of conversation we had during the first podcast was about your relationship with your specific community. That you didn't see like, hey, at some point we're gonna close our doors, but you also were like, we're not exactly sure how this.
Well, I feel like if we talk leading up to the first book, which would have been like March, April-ish of last year, at that point we would have announced already that we were closing.
Oh, see, I don't remember that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, because we announced last January, like we're closing and then we're going to do this last 6-month journey, real intentional back at our place. You want it, no more sermons, no more liturgy. We're just eating, drinking, hanging out. There's room for everything you think and feel about this, but we're also just together.
Yeah.
And I was heading towards that. And so May 29th was our last Sunday. 2 days later, my book came out, and I gave myself all of last year to go pretty slow because the books were done at the end of 2021. So last year was like promoing and doing stuff like this, but I really was like, I can feel a real sense of fragility within me. Just after the past decade, closing it, thought we were going to open back up, closing it, I can feel where I'm at, and I'm giving myself what ended up being like a year to not do a lot and suspend any need to put things in place. And thankfully we were in a place where we could do that, financially. So now when this year comes around right now is like, okay, there's some more concrete things to do.
Yeah.
And when I sat this year and reflected at the beginning, like word for the year, questions I'm asking myself, reading the text of my own heart and life, I was like, I could synthesize these questions of where am I with I'm ready. And I was like, wow, like I haven't felt like that for a long time.
You haven't felt the ready part of it.
Just the readiness to push again, the readiness to create again, the readiness to begin again and do that work. Like I knew and had confidence that day would become because of how I see death and resurrection working in the world and just going through that. But when you're not there, you're not there.
Boy. And that
so real. Yeah, so
you still have to, at the same time, I mean, you still have to you still have to live day to day. I mean, you can feel in a place to not push and not try. So talk about, I mean, we're angling, ever so not so slowly towards the kind of the heart of the new book, which is called, it's The Joy of Letting Go. You kind of, it sounds like, tell me if I'm getting this wrong. It's like you make a decision, you sort of step into that decision, and there's a way in which you make the decision, you have to act on that thing before you feel fully ready for it. The readiness for that doesn't always come until down the road. Like you don't feel oftentimes prepared for the thing you've got to do in the moment. And then you have to give yourself a season to kind of catch up with yourself. Does that sound about right?
Well, I'm sure there's some truth to what you're saying, but the sequential journey of what we were just talking about was So it's a fascinating thing. I'm promoting, doing podcasts and having conversations and doing an event for the joy of letting go. And I'm telling people, I'm not 3 years later, like how a lot of pastoral stories, like I once struggled, but damn it, now I'm happy,
Yeah.
It's like I'm in the middle of not a small form of letting go, like accepting someone's making noise when I was trying to sit in silence. That's a small form of letting go.
Yeah.
I just gave about a decade of my life to something and it's over.
Yeah.
And I consciously decided that's a big form of letting go, especially
Yes.
vocationally. So what I was saying is you let go, and I'm like, there's more life ahead. There's more vocational offering, creativity, more of the same things I'm doing, just a different structure. And I know that, but I'm also, when I first let go, I'm not ready, prepared. My heart space is
Yeah.
not there. I'm tired. I'm fragile. I'm grieving. I'm letting go. I'm in that in-between space. And
Yeah.
you cannot, as much as neurotic types and overworking types want to artificially manufacture enough inspiration or ego willpower to just get there,
Yeah.
when you're really reading your life closely, resurrection is a mysterious thing. When you
Yeah.
truly embrace the death and letting go, you trust resurrection energy will come, but you can't force it to be born again in you and on your
Yeah.
timeline. So
I
yeah.
maybe that's actually what I mean is like there's a sense of like you have to make the decision there. Maybe there's like the false expectation that being ready to let go means being at peace with all of it.
Mm,
And
mm,
there is, in part of what I'm hearing you communicate, it's been my
mm,
experience as well. There's just that kind of peace that maybe we're sort of lied to about when you come to make a decision like, okay, I'm ready to go now. Like almost never happens. That sort of settledness about like this letting go or this decision, this is going to work out, doesn't come till down the road.
mm,
You let
mm,
go and there's still turbulence. It's not like there was
mm,
before. There's still turbulence that like
mm.
you live in for a season. Like as opposed to
Absolutely.
like the cold turkey, like I've let go. That was the last season. That was Tuesday. It's Thursday now. Let's roll.
Mm.
No, it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah, and I think with that said, acceptance always comes before letting go.
Yeah, man.
You cannot let go of something unless you have first accepted it and taken it into yourself fully, felt it all the way through, exhausted of any power it has over you to make you want to stay stuck. So you can come to a point where you're like, I like, say for example, moving on from Imagine, I can accept this is not a rebuilding season. This is actually, we're using the metaphor of hospice for where we were. Okay,
Yeah.
I can accept that. I can accept we're moving into a time where it feels like the right thing to do is let go. So while I can be in full acceptance of where I am, that does not negate the grief, the pain, the heaviness, and the hard part of, yes, I have accepted it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean I'm immediately ready to jump into another creative endeavor. Actually, that feels impossible to me right now.
Yeah.
When you're in a season of grieving and death and letting go of something really big, the speculation of once having the energy to risk again and push again, I'm not ready for that. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like, you, to me, the phrase is this phrase is really important, and I get some form of it from Ken Wilber, but he's like, it will, when you practice acceptance, I'm adding to that, like it hurts more, but it bothers you less.
Say more. It
Hurting
hurts
is,
more. It bothers you less. What's the difference?
that's the reality of acceptance. Whenever people talk about suffering, whether it's in the Buddhist tradition or I think for, any awakened people, they're like, the real suffering is not suffering itself, it's our resistance to suffering.
Hmm.
So it's suffering plus non-acceptance, resistance to, or denial of the suffering. You're still
Yeah.
bargaining. You still don't want to fully accept this because that means it's not that. And I never thought I could let go of whatever that is because that feels so essential to who I am, some version of that. So when it comes to acceptance, it's, this thing no longer bothers me. Bothers me is
Mm.
non-acceptance. Bothers me as I'm resisting it. Bother me as I'm still not ready to embrace it.
Yeah.
So it does not bother me, but it still hurts. I
Yeah.
can fully accept this happened to my life or didn't go the way I want. And it doesn't bother me. I'm not bargaining with it. I'm not fighting it. I'm fully taken into myself, but it still hurts. The pain
Yeah.
is real. There's just, that's why I say Mystics are people who can live with pure acceptance.
Yeah.
This happened and it hurts, but there's no part of me that's running from it, denying it, bargaining with it,
Yeah.
like justifying against it. No, I'm saying it right now. This is just really, really hard.
Yep.
And I trust I can move through this. That's the power of resurrection, of God carrying us through these impossible in-between spaces. But it's real. And I feel it, and it's embodied, and it's physiological when it flows through me. It's not just in my heart, it's everything.
Yeah. You're probably somewhat familiar with Keating's welcoming prayer that this speaks to a little bit. And one of the hangups that when I've either taught or led this prayer or introduced people to the prayer, one of the hangups that folks will have, and I have had it as well, is there's an aspect of the prayer in which says, I welcome everything that comes today because I know it's for my healing. Like that, one of the opening lines to the welcoming prayers, I welcome everything that comes today because I know it's for my healing. And what a trip for a lot of folks, that like the acceptance to, when you're talking about pure acceptance, this is what is. And to believe that somehow, not even this like I get good for it, because good comes with all these weird qualifications, but that I know it's for my healing. That's, when you title a book "The Joy of Letting Go," it's easier to think about things in terms of like the work of letting go, or like dealing with the pain of letting go, or like the process of letting go. But when you title a book "The Joy of Letting Go," part of what you get to is like, I know that there's something in here in me that is for my healing, that's good, true, and beautiful. And I don't have to resist this moment. I can accept and embrace the pain that comes with letting go. It's a provocative title. I mean, it's easy to just read, "Oh, the joy of letting go," but actually looking at the phrase,
yay!
Yay! Exactly. It's like, for the, as the writer of Hebrews, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Like, that's a cute phrase until you think about actually being crucified. And you're like, what the hell joy are we talking about? You're in the midst of that even now, like life-wise, the pure acceptance of you've let go of a thing that was a good work. It was a part of you, and you're experiencing the actual grief and the pain that comes with that. Talk about the word joy then. You title this joy. There's an acceptance part of it. How does joy play into this then?
Well, one, I have the audacity to believe, in the same way the welcoming prayer says you can welcome everything because it's for my healing. I have the audacity to believe that all of this is somehow leveraged for joy. And that's not that's not an easy thing to say.
No.
That sounds naive. It sounds like I'm just a foolish 22-year-old who's like, yes, Jesus, like from here, we're just riding the escalator up and we never stop, when in reality, that's just not my story at all.
No.
And one of my favorite sections, moments of scripture is, that conversation Jesus has with his disciples in John 14-17, the night before he's going to be killed. John's gospel, obviously, is very different. There's other stories in there. And that conversation with his disciples, his friends, when things are really about to happen, he is facing the beginning of a death, an acceptance, a massive form of tragedy, a real source of pain, abandonment. He's on the edge of that, and he just keeps on talking about joy.
Yep.
In that conversation, so your joy may be full. In John 15:11, I believe. I'm like, there's something real there. There's something very, very real there. And so one, I really, really, really believe that. And I'm like, the last conversation ever, it's not dogma, it's not doctrine, it's not abstract beliefs, it's joy.
Yeah.
It's not, here's what we got to do. It's not like all of the entrepreneurial, like you got to wake up at 4 a.m. and start 5 LLCs by the time 6 a.m. comes around. Like, it's not ego strength and willpower and doing 1,000 push-ups by 3 a.m. It's joy. And there's something very provocative and beautiful about that keeps me a Christian, that makes me really believe this story. And the title's a paradox.
Yes, it is.
It's the joy of letting go. Like we would say, the life that comes from death, or how everything comes from nothing, and how light is born out of darkness. Like, you get to the depths of reality and you're faced with all of these creative tensions and paradoxes that I just come to love.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's such a paradox and it's so hard. It's one of those things where, as a pastor for so long, as a person who's preached, as a person who's a guide and pastors and cares for people, it's one of those truths where I'm like, I wish I didn't have to say this to you.
Yeah.
I
There's a
wish I didn't have to tell you the joy is so real, but it comes after the letting go, or
and
the life is so real. Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
there's a generality to it that's part of what's provocative, and it kind of runs through the book. Is oftentimes when we talk about when I'll just say when we talk about letting go,
Me and you right now, we're here.
when we talk about letting go, and maybe like the joy, anything like the joy, the goodness of it, like we got let seasons pass. Like if there's a consolation in like letting a season pass or letting what was go, if there's a consolation in grief, it's often the I would suggest false hope, oftentimes false hope, of either like knowing what it's for, like or knowing what comes next. So which is different than saying it is for something and I don't know what, and there will be an X, but I don't know what it is. That's not, there's less consolation in not knowing. There is a false consolation in, I'm grieving, this hurts, I've let go, but I know what it's for. And so we do the
because
22.
God did it because of that. And it's like that red yarn.
And that's where exactly. And that's where we do the 22-year-old yay Jesus thing, which like, listen, because I'm gonna be a better boyfriend after this breakup. And you're like, I don't know, you're a pretty bad boyfriend. I think there's some other stuff. Or like I know what comes next is I've let go of this so that I can move on to this. And there's always this, not always, but there's often a specific next. What do you do personally with the empty space? If this is a season, I think that's highly responsible. If this is a season to, you said a moment ago, and go back, like, this is not a season to build. This is not a season to reinvent. You're not, because knowing you decently well, you live as a mystic. You also function as an entrepreneur. Like you create things, and there's an energy in life for you for creating things. What do you do with that impetus? The desire to replace. So, when you've had a thing that was how you lived and you've let go, what do you do with the impetus, the desire to either like name what it was for or know or build what comes next? What do you do with those impulses now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And those are great insights of, well, I can accept this letting go because I am explaining to myself exactly why the bad thing happened. Well, for me, that's the ego's, and then so oftentimes the ego's need for understanding of it, why everything works, is just another way for the ego to remain in control, to not face the unknown. And then the other part is, well, this happened now. Now, instead of explaining why, a part of me goes, well, because it leads to these exact circumstances. Like that's what I hear from you, and it's so true. That's what the ego wants to do, and I'm like, no, it's neither one of those. Actually, the death usually means it's not going to work out the way you want circumstantially.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean something won't be born in its place that's beautiful and real for you whenever it comes, but doesn't lead to that right away. And also, I have, when it comes to that stuff of death, there's almost nothing in me at this point in my life that needs to explain loss and death. It just is what it is. Life and death is not, they're larger seasons of our life. Like even you could say summer, spring, winter, fall. These are seasons I think even the individual souls go through. But also there's seasons of, that was a big death and I'm in a grieving sort of holding that space. And then there's a new life burst. But actually life, death, and resurrection is a constant seam and a perpetual flow that's happening in and through and around us all the time. And that's why mystics talk about practicing 1,000, which is really more, practicing 100,000 small deaths along the way always prepares you for the big ones and eventually the ultimate one. So I've not just, we all experience death, but it doesn't mean we accept death fully in us when it comes. That's our role of
Yeah.
acceptance. And when you do that enough, that to me is the story of being a Christian. You're like, this death is a part of it. You don't
Yeah.
have to learn to enjoy it, but you do have to learn to embrace it. That is a mystery people usually discover very late in life, if they ever get there. Is when the loss comes, I have to actually, if you could see the video we're on right now, take it into me and hold it and accept it and embrace it as much in my heart and welcome it in the same way I would do a good thing. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean I like it, but it does mean I accept it. And so I don't feel the need to explain those things. I'm just like, this is hard because life has really hard things in it. And that's how this works. Now, the in-between space, right? Like, I'm not just like, well, I'm in an in-between space. I'll just lay in my bed until my kids get home and I have something to do. Like, even this year, I'm like, I'm coming off of this. I'm in a healing time and allowing myself to be restored slowly, just from the state of my heart, fragility after a decade, so much loss of so much good stuff and so much hard stuff that comes from leading. I'm like, I can feel I'm there as a whole, but also, well, my first book's coming out, so I'm going to do promo stuff. I'm reaching out to guys like Justin and harassing them until they get me on their podcast. That's a part of my work. Like,
Yeah.
I'm doing this work because I'm sustaining something I've created, but I'm like, I also know this larger vocational, I have to put things in place. Like, I can feel and know the difference between something authentic and the ego's need for security. So let me just
Yeah.
do something. The ego's need to just stay busy. That's why it's in the first book, but I say something like, a lot of religious activity is just the ego dressed up in church clothes trying to stay busy.
Yep.
And a lot was like, because what do I do? You just be exactly where you are. This is
Mm.
a time. I'm still right now, like, when I said I'm ready for this year, but that's 12 days ago I said that. I'm just now starting to
Mm.
actually take steps through this in between liminal space. And for about a year, I just let myself be there. I don't know exactly what's coming next. I have a sense, I can get some glimpses. I have an overall vision of the things I want to keep doing, but I really don't know what that means concretely.
Mm.
And I didn't know the steps at that point. And I'm still just, there's no spotlight for the whole future, but I am carrying a torch. I get that from Shane Hips a long time ago. That's allowing me to take the next two steps. So when it's time to take those two steps, I need the courage to move forward.
Yeah.
But when it's not, I need the courage to not move forward out of the ego's impetus and impulse to just do
Yep.
something because I can't handle being carried through. Like, no, in the in-between space of letting go and joy of death and resurrection, that is where faith really has its teeth, because faith
That's
right
good.
there for the past year is not, these are the abstract beliefs I hold on to about God. No, it's the foundational belief that God is holding me through this and I don't
Yeah.
have to force this. So there is that idea of holding space, accepting, letting go, accepting pain into your body. Can you hold that space long enough until it no longer dominates you?
That's
In
good.
between spaces, can you hold that uncomfortable, unknowing, in between, betwixt liminal space long enough to let resurrection happen on a
Mm-hmm.
real, at the pace of grace, and not your willpower just
Yeah.
forcing life to be what you need it to be right now because you're scared.
Which
So
ultimately amounts to like getting well enough so that I can move on. Like I want to get well, not so that I'm whole or well. I want to get well so that I can move on, as opposed to, like you said, like the pace of grace takes longer. It's less sure of its conclusions. In the same way, we were talking a moment ago, in the same way that there's, and I like your emphasis on like the ego's need to or desire to control, and one of those controls comes in like, I if I'm going to suffer this, I need to know specifically what it's for, or I need to know what specifically comes next. You also address this in the book. Part of the way the ego wants to control as well is a kind of in the same way we want to attach to a certain future, we want to attach to certain meanings of the past. And there's a moment in the book. I'm going to read you your book.
come on now.
Where page 65, you're talking about change, and you say, here's the thing, change is never about
Oh,
betraying.
nice. I didn't even realize I forgot that I sent you a hard
I
copy.
got you right
That's
here.
dope to see it on screen. There we
Got it right
go.
here. Boom, the book. Here's the thing. Change is never about betraying where you've been. It's always about becoming who you are. And this is another way of like of addressing or talking about that the sort of transcend and include, like the need to transcend and include versus like to sort of just like quit and move on, or like stop and move on. It's never about betraying where you've been. It's about becoming who you are, and that who you are includes the past. Part of what the ego seems to want to do is to have been so sure about the decisions we made in the past that like we were right about this decision, and that we were right about who we were in this cultural, moment. It makes it harder to let go, because that becomes the entirety of who we are. I was this person. It's what we do. It's the issue with the deconstructionist movement in my mind is like, this is what I used to be, and now I'm something else. And it's like, I just don't think you get to make that call. Like, I think that is also who you are, who you were. Talk about, like, as someone who has identified internally as a pastor, and was identified by a tribe of people and a culture of people that you loved and who loved you as a pastor. Talk about that part of when you move away from something like the pastorate, it can be a little bit different than moving away from like selling cars. Like, I used to sell cars. I don't want to sell cars anymore. I was a used car salesman. The pastor identity has like it, like that can feel like moving on from being a pastor can feel like, and it often is treated like, a betrayal. Like, if you don't want to be a pastor anymore, you've really left you've left the tribe entirely here. Talk about that for you emotionally, no longer playing that role. What's that felt like? What are you doing? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah. The tribe. What an interesting thing, the way tribal consciousness works, the way badges and markers that define who's in and who's out, who's acceptable, who's safe, all that stuff.
Yeah.
I will say, and I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, without me growing up connected to anything evangelical, like not knowing it existed, coming into it later in life, and then moving through it quickly, while accepting it as a part of my past and loving it and having great experiences. I don't know if I said this the first time. I met you when you led a retreat for like creatives at Rock Harbor. Did I tell you that? I was like 20, 23, 24. So totally. It was a part of going through that tribe, which is why we connected. And the reason why I say that is I didn't have as deep, I should say, of ideological ties to that tribe as other people, because I didn't grow up with it. It wasn't tied in with family systems for me. It wasn't tied in with the primary formation of my social self as a teenager. It was like, imagine I grow up in the wild, and then I come onto the settlement for a few years, and it's like, hey, this is how we do things. This is how it all works. I'm like, this is cool. These are nice people. And a few years goes by, I'm like, these are cool people, but it's actually much bigger than this. Let's keep moving forward. So,
like, you could appreciate, in other words, part of what I'm hearing you say is even as your role as a pastor in a particular place had less of the gravitational, like less of like the anchoring identity,
the
thing
tribal
that does,
identity. Yes.
Like, I am a pastor because culturally you came in from the outside of the machinery, and like, this is a thing people do. I could do this for a season. It's a job, and I can put the whole of myself into it while I'm here, but this is not the whole of who I am. Is that part of, is that kind of what I'm hearing you say?
That's a good, yes, that's a good way of saying it. And so for me, even at whatever point after starting Imagine, I could lead the church and say, I'm not Imagine. Imagine is the primary vehicle through which the life of God is flowing through me and as me for the sake of the world. And I love it. It's really hard and it's a weird thing, but I love it. And that's great. But one day, like, I went into Imagine at 28 saying, I'm going to do this for about 10 years. I just had that sense. And it ended up being about a decade, which is interesting. And so for me, when Imagine ends, I don't have any identity crisis because I'm like, no, the form changes, but the flow of the
Yeah.
life of God in the world unfolding in my life is the same. The
Yes.
structure changes, but the substance of Christ who holds all things together, the substance of the Christ who holds me together, and whatever I am and whatever I'm giving, it's the same energy. And I look at that with like roles and positions, especially with spiritual authority. I could look at my life and say, I don't do this because I'm a pastor. It's accurate to say I'm a pastor because I do this. That's the
Mm.
difference between leading from the outside in and the inside out. It's like, I wasn't like, oh no, like I'm a pastor. I better start listening to people and guiding
Yeah.
people and helping them wake up. It was like, no, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
That's what's in me. And
That's
the
good.
pastor is the role that allows me to do that in an organized way, which is good.
Yeah.
But the organization of that flow at this point in my life is significantly different. But
Yeah.
for me, post congregational at this point in my life, I don't feel any different.
Yeah.
I just have less meetings I don't know how to lead, I'm responsible for. That's the biggest difference.
It's a bit of a trip. You know, I'll send you. I don't know if I did or not or yet, but I'll send you at least a digital copy sometime soon of the book that I'm releasing in May, and one of the chapters, it's a book about the rhythm and the tension between work and rest, and that it's really in that rhythm and tension that we discover our belovedness. That I can't rest myself into belovedness. I can't work myself into belovedness. It's what you're saying. Like it's bigger than this. Like my belovedness is like really the essential part of it. That's why I do the work. It's why I rest, is because of who I am as a beloved person. And I talk about this moment. I was in Calcutta, India, and I'm walking through this space, and someone had built one of those sand mandalas. And I mean, they take hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, depending on the size. This thing was like 6 or 7 feet across, so it took like several days for this person to put. I didn't see it, or I think I saw it, but I didn't like recognize it as like as sand. And I step in it, and it's sand, and just like the poofs, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like I stepped on somebody's artwork. And the person who's like the artist who's responsible for it is there, and he's building another one up the way, and he just gets up, he comes over, and he starts putting it back together. I'm like, and I'm like, man, I'm so sorry. Like I'm so, and he's like, and he goes on to explain which I didn't know about the mandalas, is that part of the beauty of the thing is that it's not permanent. It's like you spend all this time, it's grains of freaking sand, like placing these things and organizing it. And all the while you're doing it, it goes away at some point. Talk about a practice that is so fundamentally unlike the way we tend to build things in not just the West, and not just the religious West, but really specifically like the evangelical or mainline Christian tradition in the American West, is the expectation that we're going to build something that lasts. I'm realizing now is because I think and I expect that that's going to house my identity. Like I build the thing. I build a thing where I feel like I can build myself into the brickwork, and I will live there forever. That's so different than being able to, I'm going to do this for a season and it is not who I am. It makes it impossible emotionally in that moment to actually let go when the time comes to let go. Cause I feel like I built a thing for my life till this is where I live. This is my identities in this thing. I can't let it go because I'm letting go of who I am, which is again why I found that passage so potent. You're not betraying who you are. You're becoming who you are, and recognizing that this was a season in which you got to play that role, and that's an aspect of who you are, but you're bigger than that.
Yeah.
Talk to pastors for a minute who talk to pastors right now for a minute about this season, because and I know you're not the only cat out there who like was a pastor of a church yesterday and isn't now.
Totally.
And a lot of folks like you and I, aren't feeling like you and I. They're feeling really lost. They're feeling really trapped, and they're feeling like they've betrayed themselves, they've betrayed Christ, they've betrayed the tribe, and they've failed. Talk to these cats about letting go. Like, what do they
Oh,
need to know?
man.
What do they need to hear?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question because it just lands for me. Whatever we're talking about, if it doesn't land in the concrete, I'm just like not interested.
Yeah.
Abstract beliefs, arguments, I could care less, to be
No, let's
honest.
help some cats.
It, insofar as the spirit unfolds in and through our lives, that's what matters to me
Yeah.
pastorally. And I love pastors, I really do. And I
Yeah.
think
Same.
of course, there's abusive ones and all kinds of horrible things that can be done with power and grasping. But for the people who really want to serve and do it humbly, I'm like, this is the salt of the earth. I love
Mm.
these people and I think they're amazing. And if they want to stay in that role, I want them to keep going in a way that allows them to sustain joy. That's a part of the
Mm.
book. What you're describing about investing and over identifying our sense of self with our roles is, and this is for pastors right now too, because they're interconnected for a lot of people, is also true for particular beliefs we have.
Mm.
You
It's good.
think you are your work and you think you are your beliefs. And actually, you're neither one of them. That self that is
Mm.
grounded in Christ, has beliefs and is not those beliefs.
That's
That's why
really
when
good.
beliefs change, not only do you not change in a negative way, but when your beliefs change and truly evolve and you're not overly identified with old beliefs, more of you actually naturally emerges to the surface. You're not betraying where you've been, you're becoming more of who you are. That part of you that thinks, well, if I no longer believe that, or if I believe this now, and it's really just going against the tribe, you're not going against God. If you're just transcending the tribe, that's okay.
Mm.
They're not the ones, they don't have a monopoly on God. Nobody does,
True story,
So
man.
one, your beliefs can evolve and you can be less certain. That's a fascinating thing. You can be less certain about your beliefs and be more free in Christ. What a funny thing. You can be
Mhm.
less certain about what you believe about Jesus and actually more free in Christ, and thus more loving, compassionate, and more Christ-like for the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
What an amazing journey we can go on and allow ourselves to have the permission to let the chips of our thinking fall wherever they may, knowing whatever's there, this benevolent, loving, grace, transformative center, these eyes that are fixed upon us with affirmation, those don't change because we don't think this about the atonement anymore. That's ridiculous. We're
Yeah.
not 17, in youth group, like, oh my gosh, if I do this, I'm gone.
Yeah.
It's not a tightrope. It's an ocean we're swimming in. That's a different approach to things.
Yeah.
And then, man, the identity thing it's so real because you don't know how over identified with something you are until it is taken away from you or starts to pull away. Then you're like, what am I without this?
Yep.
That I'm Kevin the pastor. No, you're just this person. And
Yeah.
even for people who are more evangelical, I just read this for this thing I'm doing coming up, and Dallas Willard said, that's why I'm quoting a more evangelically accepted
Yes.
person, but he says, God's more interested in you than he is in your ministry. That is an invitation not to be a better pastor, not to be more successful, but to be a more whole human who knows that they're loved.
Yeah.
That's what I want for pastors, is actually the very moment that can feel like a loss in the foundation of your faith and sense of self might just be the Spirit inviting you to the future
Yeah.
of your faith and a more spacious sense of self. You are not that thing that you're doing, even if those things are good.
True.
Whoever your true self is before, beneath, and beyond whatever particular role you're playing, and the substance of that role. You love to teach, you love
Mhm.
to guide people, you want to care for people. You don't need that role to do any of those
Yeah.
things.
If that role
You know,
houses those gifts in you, fantastic. But it's the
exact
gifts in you that matter.
insofar as that role liberates those good parts of you, awesome. But when it ends up getting in the way, then shed the role, and more of the life of Christ in and through you will actually flow into the world. And I would say that's the same for your belief system as well.
Good.
Eventually just gets in the way. That's something that fascinates me about people, and it's really tragic as well, as when your beliefs in God get in the way of you loving like Jesus.
Mm,
Probably get rid of them.
yeah,
Just probably there's a time to move beyond that old skin
yep,
and move beyond that old system. So that's my message to those pastors is like, there's so much more life ahead, and actually there's more of you ahead
that's
if
good.
you do the work of letting go and surrendering. Like, so much of our suffering is just over identifying with things that aren't who we are.
And I wish it wasn't, and I get that. I get that it is, and I understand why it is, but it ought not to be, or I wish that it were not as scandalous a thing to say that there is no work that you do in your life ever, regardless of the work, regardless of its impact, regardless of its sacred nature, regardless of its delicate. There's literally not a single work you'll ever do in your life that is more important than the person you are while you do it.
Mm,
And that when we
mm,
flip that script
mm,
when we flip that script and we make the work we're doing more important or more definitive of who we are, we actually give into the same system that sets up the abuses that we're trying to make right by doing the work to begin with. So for folks who work in fields like, like global hunger or human
mm,
trafficking, those are like, my God, please someone do these jobs. They're like essential. But the same system that tells wealthy men that the value in that 9 to 12 to 15-year-old girl is in her usefulness to you, that same system of thought is telling the people who work in the field that your life is predicated, the value of your life is predicated on your usefulness to the mission.
mm,
So it shouldn't be so scandalous a thing to hear, for pastors to hear, that regardless of how important your job is, you're more important than the
mm,
thing you're doing. But it is a
mm.
scandal.
Yeah.
It's received as a scandal to think of
Mm.
oneself as valuable that way.
Yeah, of course, in that distinction you just made, our connection, like one abusive, oppressive, clearly wrong, clearly unjust. Let's name it. We're going to go against it. But even when one's not abusive or externally frowned upon, because oftentimes we're rewarded for our dysfunctions in a particular, form of relating to each other in a culture.
Mhm.
So the one of the abuse, of course, is wrong and unjust. But another form of that's not unjust to others in a system, but is still operating with the similar inner logic of usefulness and productivity and objectifying and dehumanizing or whatever it is I do this, therefore I'm that, or
Mm.
my values based on my usefulness or productivity or whatever it is. And that is one thing you can't fully get until you feel it for yourself. Is, for some
Mhm.
people who are like, well, if it's not this impulsive need to change things or this, like, what do you don't do anything? I'm like, no. No, after the death of the egoic operating system that says I have to change this or else I won't be okay, or I have to do this in order to be seen as valuable, what's born in its place is not apathy, it's compassion. That's
Yes.
why I think it's in this book I say there's a difference between doing something out of compulsion and doing it out of compassion.
Mhm.
Compulsion is, I have to change things because of this ego need to win. I have to change things or I won't be okay. I need the system to be right or else I'll never be able to, I don't know, be at peace. I'm like, that's actually a very dangerous way to operate. Now, there will be a season of your life where you will do objectively good things because you'll be working against injustice. That's fantastic. Let's celebrate that. But if you say, I will never be at peace until this changes as a
Whew.
whole, then you'll never be at
That's not a
peace.
bet you want to place.
No, and that's like in this, like compulsion says, I need this to change or I won't be okay. Compassion says, I'm working for this to change for the sake of others, but mysteriously and scandalously, like you said, I'm okay,
Mhm.
even in the midst of an unfinished world. And that is the gift of, when you talk about knowing your belovedness, is I'm working out of a compassion to give myself to the world, not a compulsion to try to get something from the world,
That's
because it's not its
fantastic.
place to give it. So that's a there's a second half of life journey for people that says you can keep giving yourself. You can keep creating. You can keep working for justice pastoring, but the energy with which you do that from in this open space of belovedness that allows it to be real compassion and not the ego compulsion that leaves you grinding and unhappy all the time, that's a whole different way. You're not slowing down in terms of not giving yourself fully. You might be slowing down in a practical sense because you don't have to kill yourself to do this. But man, sometimes like that's where the real work of love and unconditional love and compassion begins, because you're like, oh, I don't need you to change for me. I want you to change for you. And if you don't, I'm okay.
There's another section in your book that I bookmarked that's a little bit deeper in which you said this is page 159, and I'll actually take these off because they can read better than them. So let me share with you a deep suspicion I have had for a long time about many people's path with God. Much of what is communicated as religious obedience or spiritual piety is actually just passivity and disempowerment. God has created us for creativity, but we prefer conformity. God has created us for innovation, but we prefer to gather more information. God has created us for spiritual experience. We prefer living up to people's expectations. When adults speak of obedience to God so often, it sounds like children who are begrudgingly doing what is right, even though beneath the surface, they would rather be doing something else. Elaborate on that from the standpoint of not church leader person, but the congregate who's never made a decision in their life about how religious life works. Someone else has made those decisions forever. That was their parents. It was the youth pastor. It was their pastor. Maybe it was a spiritual therapist at some point. Like someone, someone has always made decisions for them, and their obedience has always been to just like they're not operating in the what I want. They're operating in like what I'm told to do. That is a trap. Talk to those folks now about like elaborate on this notion here that like we confuse obedience with that kind of begrudging yes, fine, I'll do it. Like what is there instead of that? What does it mean to give into one's creativity and to move away from information and to value experience? Talk to those folks for a minute.
It's scary to know how free we really are. That's why, people moving on from trauma, people evolving past old stages of faith in life, people moving beyond tribes. It's scary to see how free you are to choose.
Yes.
It's really scary because we've had external authority figures that have, regardless of whether they were good or bad or abusive or whatever, that have helped make sense of life for us. They believe this, as long as I conform to it, there's a sense of security to that. I'm in a toxic, even like, why do people stay in toxic, abusive relationships for so long? Because the ego prefers familiar pain over uncertainty. That's a crazy thing. I've seen that pastorally so much. I'm like, wow, we will choose familiar pain over making the choice out of our freedom to move beyond it. So when I'm talking about trauma and other things, is because with the familiar pain, we're still in control and we can manage it ourselves. I know when it's coming. I know how to respond. I know our rituals. We make up like this. You do this again. 4 o'clock comes. You come home from work. I can manage that myself and be in control, even though it's killing me and it's horrible. The freedom to choose beyond that is like, I'm moving beyond old management systems into this world of freedom and choice and creativity beyond conformity and living up to expectations. And that, especially at first, is very terrifying. It's liberating and terrifying. Yep. And we live somewhere in between those, depending on whether it's the afternoon or 9 a.m. or how much coffee we've had, or maybe we're hungry or whatever. Yep. And I don't use the language of obedience as an adult. It makes no sense to me.
Fascinating.
Zero. I don't think I've ever used that for 10 years of pastoring. I don't think I ever used that word once.
Why
now,
not?
For my Bible,
for you personally, friends, or for as a leader?
as a leader for
Period.
others.
Really?
Well, I'm like, what does obedience have to do with this kind of freedom?
Mm.
What does obedience have? I'm not doing this because I'm being obedient to a God who's demanding or telling me to do something I don't want to do. I'm doing this because this is the natural expression of a life that has been liberated and is driven by love and not
Mm.
unhealthy ambition to destroy, to control, to dominate, or to just make myself be a lord of my own little kingdom.
Hmm.
Like, what is that? I want, like, my children are 4 and 6. So developmentally, I'm sure I use those words for them. Hey, when mommy and daddy tell you this, sometimes you just have to listen and trust it, or whatever, developmentally, that's appropriate for a 4 to 6 year old, maybe 12, 13, or you're in a house until you're 18. Okay, we can talk. We have rules and boundaries. That's cool. It's helpful at that particular stage. But at 28, if you're doing something for God begrudgingly because you think you're being obedient, I'm like, that is not what this is all about.
Mm.
That we're no longer choosing right or wrong or trying not to sin because God's telling us not to. No, the Spirit is inviting us into freedom and into joy and into peace. There's an entirely different vocabulary of language at work in that economy of grace than there is in this God is still this object outside of my life who's trying to get me to do something or live a particular way. So
Yeah.
to me, the language of I'm not asking, say at this point in my life, I'm not asking, is my next decision right or wrong? I'm saying, what does love and creativity look like for me right now? And how do I want to do it? I'm actually asking myself, what do I want?
Yeah.
I'm not saying, what does God want from me? I'm operating with the assumption that when I align my life and my deepest prayers with the natural prayers of the Spirit who's longing for something to happen in and through this world, I'm trusting that we're flowing together.
And one would hope that
I'm
if the process is if what we're in, at least in part, is a long-term formational work, then at some point I become more like Christ.
absolutely.
Even in right, even in my desires, even in my interests and my preferences. And so if I say this is what I want, if I say this is what I want and I'm 13, that's one thing. If I say this is what I want and I'm 46, and if I've done
hopefully
if I've done the work,
exactly
I'm more in alignment with the will and the desires of the Christ who's been shaping me. Part of the trick there, and that's part of why I asked the question, part of the trick there is so few have done the work that leads to that might lead to that kind of trust, and they rightly mistrust their own interests and desires. Like, you don't know what it's like. I mean, you and I both have been around enough young adults, and there's that fear of like picking the wrong college, of choosing the wrong job. And it's not like it's for some cats, it's not like, I don't want to pick a job I don't like, or I don't want to pick a job I'm not good at. Those ain't even on considerations. I don't want to pick the wrong job, or I don't want to go to, I don't want, like, I don't want to go to the wrong school, as if like you, like, God, you like choose Harvard and the Lord's like, I said Yale and now I'm pissed. Like,
I said that you got accepted at Harvard. I said the community college around the corner from your house.
Yes,
idiot.
I said Cabrillo. You're supposed to go to Cabrillo. What are you doing at Harvard? I said Cabrillo. Clearly, I don't know how you got Harvard.
And by the way, for people listening, not there's anything wrong with community college. I started off my journey at a JUCO, so come on now.
Huge fan. Did a whole 2 years. Thank God.
Well, that's where I'm like, that is an important question I'm like, you have to have the courage to ask yourself the question, what do you want? Now, there's another part of that says, well, there's also another question that we have to ask, which you is doing the wanting. Is it you overly identify with your ego who still wants things that are driven by selfish ambition, insecurity, need for approval? Okay, well, that's a different conversation. But the more and more to say Jesus is Lord in a practical internal sense is to decenter your ego. There's a connection there for me.
Yeah.
So when your ego's been decentered, it's no longer in the driver's seat, it's no longer dominating you. It's still a part of your life. No one ever kills off or eliminates their ego totally. That just isn't how life works. But when it's no longer sitting on the throne, and as we like to say in evangelical-ish kind of sermons, or in the center of your life, there's a different space that opens up that allows us to make decisions out of desires that are born out of us, as opposed to ones that have been planted there in us by our family systems, by the culture, whatever. So that's what I hope later on developmentally is we're no longer saying, is this right or is it wrong? We're like, is this loving? Is it good for me and for the world? And does it bring me joy? Doesn't mean it won't be hard, but does it bubble up within me? Does it make sense to me? Does it resonate with who I am and how the Spirit of God is unfolding in and through me for the sake of the world? And that's why when Jesus calls us to love our neighbor, and Rumi says there's 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground, I think there is almost an infinite number of ways we can care for the planet. We can love our neighbor. We can create beautiful things. We can care for those who are hurting. And, that's a very personal, situational, pastoral, formational. Where is a person? You can be around a person and be like, if I'm not going to ask you right now the simple question of what do you want? But later on, you're like, no, you're actually ready to ask that. You're not giving you don't know you have the permission to transcend that barrier that's getting in the way of some obedient sort of tit for tat. No, I think you're ready. What do you want right now? Want to go here? Do it, dude. Like,
and that's part of your emphasis of like letting go of some of those belief systems that keep us from that kind of growth. Because if part of my belief system, if I hold on to a more childish belief system in which the goal is to get things right so that God stays happy with me, then that delayed adolescence continues on into adulthood, and I don't get to flourish. I don't get to become, like you were mentioning earlier in the book, like it's not about becoming who I am. It's always going to be about getting the test right. I'm always studying for the test that's coming up next week, and I'm not just learning so that I can grow. That is a belief system that is worth letting go of so that I might actually grow and become, which was the goal all along.
Which is why a lot of the sermons you might hear, I'm like, it's not that these are bad. They're just appropriate if you were 16 or 17.
Yes. And nothing against being 16 or 17. Just don't be 16 or 17 when you're 34.
That's what it's like. In the first book, I say like most preaching, we talked about Joel Osteen in the first episode, most preaching is cheerleading for the ego. And I'm like, and most sermons is fortifying the egoic self of a teenager.
Yeah.
I'm like, eventually you form, you ground, you give the self a positive identity. And once you do that, it's solidified and it's healthy to a degree. Now we can start hearing this different invitation of the Christ and Jesus who invites us beyond to die to that self and to be born as something bigger. And to me, I'm like, sermons over and over are solidifying, grounding, and fortifying this first sense of self, which to me is good when you're young, but it's the very self we have to transcend to get to the economy of grace, to get to the place where we can say, what does love look like right here? What do I want? How am I going to serve? As opposed to still saying like, well, it's like God just doesn't like me, but I got to be obedient. It's like, dude, you're 50.
Yeah.
Doesn't this suck by now? Like, you still doing this?
Well, hey man, I'm really glad you wrote the book. I enjoyed it, and I think other folks will really actually honestly benefit from it. I think some of the language in here is really, really freeing, powerful. It's super accessible, but it does that loving work that good pastoring does, and that good books do is to meet a reader wherever that reader is with regards to language and imagery, but to not like leave them there. So it's not just entertainment. Like there's some great stories, some wonderful insights, but the book really does sort of call someone forward and point beyond itself. And so I'm glad to have a copy of it. And thanks for making some time today to talk through it, dude. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, Justin. I don't take for granted being invited on, so I'm really grateful for this.
And thank you for joining me and listening to this episode of the At Sea Podcast. If you would like to follow up with Kevin Sweeney, I'd suggest you actually begin with Instagram. His handle on that platform is Kevin Sweeney and then the number 1. From there, you can jump to Amazon or anywhere you prefer to pick up your books to grab either one of the books we talked about in this conversation, The Making of a Mystic or The Joy of Letting Go. And if you'd like to be one of the folks who helps to make this podcast happen, I'd love to have you on the team. Visit me at patreon.com/Justin McRoberts. Until next time.